We are a country obsessed with apocalypse, and not just the religious fundamentalist variety. A fear of imminent doom runs deep in popular culture and like the grim reaper stalks the environmental movement. This makes it easy to read present crises, whether it's financial meltdown, climate change, resource scarcities, as signs of the end. Now, while optimists await the wonderful new millennium to come, pessimists predict the die-out of the entire human race. Religious or secular, this is a dangerous way of thinking. It removes us from the complexity of history and human will, substituting instead simple binaries of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, savior and Satan. Rather than practical political action, it inspires fatalism and turns our rightful fears for the future into a disabling anxiety. It undermines our sense of common humanity. We come to believe that there is no hope or that salvation is reserved for only a selected few. Why is apocalyptic thinking so powerful in the United States? I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that lately. Ever since the Puritans set about to build their city on the hill, the sense that we are the chosen people, that America is the new Jerusalem, has tangled with darker visions of the hellfire and brimstone that awaits us sinners on Judgment Day. Meanwhile, our real flesh and blood sins, the slaughter of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, our invasions of other lands, rest all too easily on the collective conscience. Today, I want to focus on doomsday thinking in three key arenas: nuclear weapons, the population bomb, and climate change. I believe that the first has affected the other two in ways that are largely hidden from view, and that we need to understand the connections between them if we are to move forward to build a more secure and equitable future. Now, the popularity of apocalyptic thinking has ebbed and flowed in the United States, and perhaps we might have outgrown it as a nation if it were not for the atomic bomb, the one weapon that truly does threaten mass extinction. The nuclear chain reaction that began in 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues today in our hearts and our minds and in our souls. We cannot stop it because we have never had a true national reckoning about unleashing this terrible weapon upon the world. Now, the global peace movement did pull the Americans and Soviets back from the brink, but nuclear bombs, nuclear power, and nuclear waste are still very much with us, planetary threats of enormous magnitude. I am a child of the nuclear age. I was born in 1951 in the hot July of a very cold war. During World War II, my father was a dive bomber pilot in the Pacific, and he and my mother, like most Americans, were taught to believe that we needed to bomb Japan in order to spare him and countless other American soldiers from a deadly invasion of Japan. When I was 4, my mother developed thyroid cancer, probably from exposure to radiation in graduate school, where her best friends did secretive research for the Manhattan Project. In grade school in Dallas, Texas, I ducked and I covered under my desk. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, bomb shelter models were on display in our local shopping center parking lot. In other words, shop till you drop. Like others of my generation, I came to develop an early sense of existential absurdity and I numbed myself to the prospect of imminent annihilation. But I maintain that the terror burrowed deep, turning what should be a normal fear of death into something larger, uncontrollable, menacing. As the fog of the Cold War settled heavily over the land, the Grim Reaper stalked even us children. In New York City, public school officials experimented with giving pupils dog tags so that their bodies could be identified after the blast. Meanwhile, the tools that we really needed to make sense of contemporary events and to place ourselves in history were denied us purposefully as a matter of policy. We were not taught in school how the atomic bomb was the logical consequence of an aerial war strategy whose mission was the targeting and terrorizing of civilians as occurred in the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo. That Japan had been on the verge of surrender before we dropped the bomb was quietly left out of public discourse. The American occupying forces in Japan censored the horrific photos of charred buildings and bodies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, instead promoting the image of the mushroom cloud, distant, eerie, even beautiful. Radiation effects were covered up too. American scientists studied the victims but did nothing to treat them. Prevented from seeing the real suffering, we were persuaded to imagine ourselves as victims instead. Bombs bursting in air over major American cities became the standard images of civil defense propaganda and media thrills. There was no reckoning, no taking of responsibility. The nuclear chain reaction of dehumanization morphed into other forms, such as the population bomb of the 1960s on. Doomsday prophets warned us that the fertility of poor women of color in developing nations threatened worldwide environmental collapse, famine, political chaos, you name it. Poor people became numbers to be manipulated in forced sterilization campaigns. The population bomb set off its own mushroom cloud to obscure realities on the ground. When I lived in a Bangladesh village in the mid-1970s, I learned why people had large families. High rates of infant and child mortality meant that people had to have many children to ensure that a few would survive until adulthood. People needed children to work in the fields, and they needed sons to take care of them in their old age. Even when women wanted to space births, and many of them did, there were no decent family planning services available. This was not so very different from the situation in the United States when we once had larger families. It was clear that in Bangladesh, birth rates would come down with greater economic security, gender equality, access to healthcare and education, and indeed they have. I also learned in Bangladesh that the villagers I was living with were hardly destroying the environment. Instead, they practiced a sustainable and sophisticated form of agriculture that enhanced biodiversity and protected the soil. Apocalyptic fears of the third world population bomb threw many American environmentalists off track. The people they should have learned from and the people they should have worked with, like the small farmers of Bangladesh, were rendered into enemies in the war on population growth. Meanwhile, the plundering and pollution of natural resources by corporate and military interests were conveniently swept under the political rug. Today, as we face the urgent challenge of climate change, Doomsday thinking is unfortunately coming back in vogue, twisting our justifiable fears of catastrophic effects like sea level rise into kind of hopeless, bleak visions of the future. The old arguments and imagery of the population bomb are being resuscitated so that Americans can be made to believe that it is all those Indians, all those Chinese, even all those Africans over there who are driving climate change, and we can go on over-consuming and over-polluting the good old American way. National security agencies and analysts are deploying racially charged stereotypes of millions of climate refugees storming our borders, or poor, hungry Africans taking up arms in climate conflict to convince us that we need not feel empathy. We need not feel empathy for the people most affected by climate change, but instead we should fear them and we should turn to the military to protect us. Now, this is ironic indeed, given the fact that the Pentagon bears a huge share of responsibility for global warming. It is the single largest consumer and purchaser of oil in the world. Away with apocalypse, I say, and let us get on to the real tasks at hand. As it will take all the practical and political ingenuity we have to foster, to develop a national climate policy that works, and to make the transition out of fossil fuels towards safe, renewable energies. And as we finally, as Americans, finally assume that responsibility, we owe the world a reckoning that we have avoided since 1945. We did not need to drop the atomic bomb. It was a crime against humanity, and it was a crime against nature. We need to pledge in the spirit of a new internationalism to once and for all abolish nuclear weapons and reject their ugly twin, nuclear power. As the radiation from the Fukushima reactors in Japan continues to spread, polluting fish, crops, people, it is clearer than ever that nuclear power is not the answer to our energy needs. On the contrary, in an era of climate change, when the incidence and severity of natural disasters are likely to increase, nuclear power poses an unacceptable risk. It is time to get over our haughty American exceptionalism and to look to other nations for guidance. For example, Germany stands out for the seriousness of its reckoning with the Holocaust and Nazi war crimes. It also stands out for the seriousness of its efforts to address climate change. It is a global leader in wind and solar technologies, and it is now taking the very difficult step of phasing out nuclear power. This is not just due to enlightened government, but to the existence of a powerful and effective environmental and anti-nuclear movement that demands progress and accountability. Here in the US today, we are witnessing a similar convergence as climate justice, peace, and anti-nuclear activists join together to say no to war, no to warming, no to nuclear power. Hope is their message, and faith and trust that with enough collective will, we can get the job done. Climate change poses grave dangers, that is certain, but it also presents real opportunities for us as a nation to move beyond apocalypse and get back to Earth. Thank you.